Alan Wake, does whatever an Alan Wake can. Spins a web, Alan Wake, Alan Wake, look out, here comes.
My name is Alan Wake. I'm a writer.
Uh-oh. Alan Wake is a third-person shooter developed by Remedy Entertainment and published by Microsoft in 2010. The game is branded as survival horror, but let me tell you, that simply isn't the case. It can be tense and mysterious, but you are never wanting for ammo and there's no horror to be found. Even calling it a psychological horror is a bit of a stretch. It's a mystery thriller, expressed through generic and inoffensive third-person shooting. The game puts you in the shoes of best-selling crime fiction author Alan Wake, in a story that sees his wife kidnapped and Alan suffering a 7-day blackout. When he comes to, Alan begins to find pages of a manuscript, which, while certainly written by him, he has no recollection of writing. The spooky part is that the story on the manuscript is coming true. Alan Wake has an interesting story at the heart of it, but it's shot in the foot by its moment-to-moment gameplay. It's never outright terrible, but there are only so many multi-directional ambushes you can take before getting right proper pissed off. The environments can be even worse, with the majority of sections ranging between forest and national forest. There's only so much you can do level design-wise when environments are so open, and this all contributes to a feeling of sluggish repetition. There was a point where I believed that Alan Wake's biggest problem was with its pacing, but I was incorrect. It's with the difficulty spikes. I played on normal, and for most of the game I found it pretty easy, but for some reason, and always out of nowhere, the game will just no-rushing you with a flashlight. Alright, that's okay. The checkpointing isn't too bad, and after a couple tries I would make it through, but, often by the skin of my teeth. That was until I reached the first DLC episode, The Signal. There was so much bull in this DLC that I had to stop 2 hours in and restarted on a lower difficulty. And my god, I should have done it sooner. To be frank, Alan Wake doesn't have as competent of a combat system as it thinks it does, and for your first playthrough you should definitely just go with the lowest difficulty. The game does go down a lot smoother, allowing you to focus on what it does right and spend less time tearing your hair out about what it does wrong.
But I wasn't drunk. I wasn't drunk at the time. I only got drunk afterward.
Oh man, I've definitely been there. Combat is basically a game of juggling. You'll be out strutting your stuff in the dark forest with your flashlight, and all of a sudden time will slow down, revealing enemies in the dark.
Is a hazardous occupation.
These shadowy townspeople, known as the Taken, have a shield of shadow that must be dispelled by your trusty flashlight. The shadow shield is essentially a second health bar that needs to be taken care of before you can actually shoot them. Shining the torch on enemies will also stun them for a brief moment, but after recovering they will shield their eyes, preventing you from stun locking them. The game wants you to be cycling targets and prioritizing them, but enemies are so fast and swarmy that it just doesn't give you the chance. While there is perhaps some joy to be found here, this is just exacerbated by a lack of enemy variety. Off the top of my head, there's only around 4 different kinds of Taken, pretty much only being differentiated by their size and speed. It's like half a dozen inanimate objects that get possessed by poltergeist, and some of the most annoying birds I've ever come across in a video game. One of the best metrics there are to judge a shooter is, how well it feels to shoot things. Alan Wake feels pretty good to shoot, and the physics are fun when an enemy takes its last hit, but there is no reactivity. Precision isn't part of the equation here. You are not aiming for specific parts. You're just blasting your torch at enemies and shooting them wherever you want. I won't go as far as to say that headshots don't do extra damage because frankly I don't know, but it felt like the game just wanted me to do body shots. The game has a dodge button, which I have mixed feelings about. I found it worked well, but the game has such a tight camera and such large ambushes that it can kind of feel futile to rely on it. Luckily, the game does have an oh shit button in the form of throwables such as flares and flashbang grenades. These shadow bastards hate light, and these things will save your life when the going gets tough. The other side of the gameplay is largely just walk and talk sections with other characters. You'll know when you're in for a walk and talk by whether or not you have your flashlight and gun on you when you begin the sequence. I enjoyed these just fine as I was pretty invested in the mystery and the world, but I can certainly see how this may bore some. Maybe it was the frustration with the difficulty spikes and the annoying enemies, but I was always wishing for the combat sections to be over so I could get some more story. Something that I found disappointing was the exploration. I got the impression on seeing how many things there were to collect that the environments would be worth exploring, but I was wrong. After a while, I kind of just gave up on the idea, because more often than not, anything worth seeing was signposted by the game.
Crime and punishment. The cancer and cure of civilization. But some crimes are impossible to punish, especially in Night Springs. Tonight's episode, The Man in the Mirror.
What is worth finding are TV sets and manuscript pages. The TV sets contain episodes of an in-universe show called Night Springs. Night Springs and Bright Falls, which is something like a Twilight Zone ripoff. It's charming footage, which I imagine was just filmed with the staff around the office and overdubbed later on. All of these are pretty entertaining and worth watching. From what I understand, this is something of Remedy's signature. I've talked a lot of shit on the gameplay, and I haven't really talked much about what kept me invested in the game, and that is Alan himself. Let me just say first that this game is really tropey. It's all stuff you've seen before in Twin Peaks or read in a Stephen King novel, and played to nowhere near the same effect, but actually, this is a video game, damn it, and to be honest, I haven't seen Twin Peaks and I haven't read Stephen King, so I don't know any better anyway. I am grateful that someone who enjoys these cool things has used their craft to translate it into something that I do care about, that of which being a video game, so cheers, Remedy. Back to Alan. Alan is depressed, childish, intense, and moody. He hasn't written a word in 2 years, and it's really starting to take a toll on those around him, namely his wife Alice and his manager Barry. Alice and Barry hate each other, but what they do have in common is that they want the best for Alan, even if they have different ideas of what that means. Alice suggests that her and Alan take a trip to a small town so it can just be them together. But upon arrival, it seems that she was secretly hoping it would help with Alan's writer's block. When Alan sees the typewriter in the cabin, he throws a shit fit and goes out for a walk. Before he can get too far, he hears Alice scream, "Ah!" When he arrives, he witnesses Alice being dragged into a lake, which he promptly jumps in after her. Alan wakes up in a crashed car and will soon learn that it's been a week since Alice disappeared. From this point on, we're going to be finding manuscript pages written by Alan foreshadowing events to come, and in some cases things that are just going on in the background. They tell him that the cabin he and Alice were staying at never existed, and he's a prime suspect for his wife's disappearance. The local sheriff doesn't buy this, though, and lets Alan carry on his merry way. All throughout, we have Alan narrating pretty much everything that happens to him, and I think this is probably the make or break for a lot of people, or the combat. I personally find Alan a fun character.
I had fallen off so many cliffs it was ridiculous. That's what you get for naming a book The Sudden Stop. It was probably good I hadn't had the chance to tell Maine where I was going. I'd have to lose the cops and find my own way to the mine.
He's not the most compelling character, but his entitled attitude and moodiness give him room to grow as he becomes more experienced with dealing with what he faces. I wasn't expecting a horror game coming into this, so I kind of liked having Alan as my sidekick or something. Alan will give hints occasionally if you take too long on a section, like with one of those, I would have to turn the power back on if I was going to open the gate kind of thing, but it's refreshing to hear a character's thoughts when they're not just hints. By the end, it kind of felt like I was playing Fox Mulder from the X-Files, and that's not a protagonist we see every day in video games. The game wears its Twin Peaks references on its sleeves, but it never really does anything with the weird townsfolk trope. Besides two characters in particular, they are all mainly props for the story. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that in Alan Wake you are playing a story in a story, and maybe in another story, so it follows a familiar format of Princess being in another castle. You see, the story needs to be compelling and intricate, so the dark presence which haunts the lake doesn't cotton on to the fact that when Alan originally wrote the manuscript during his blackout, he wrote in his own escape from the story. The only thing he didn't write before he escaped the clutches of the presence was the ending. Which means the ultimate goal of Alan Wake is to reach the lake and finish the manuscript. There's lots of twists and turns, but they ultimately don't amount to anything other than a story. The way it's told is the fun part. The manuscript pages give much appreciated context, even though quote-unquote Alan's writing isn't always the best. The game itself looks pretty good. I found out after beating the game that there is a remastered version on the Epic Games Store, but upon looking at screenshots it seemed that they were pretty similar. There was a blur effect that made me motion sick, so try and turn that off. There's some really nice vistas in most of the levels, and you're able to see your destination throughout. This is a blessing and a curse, because sometimes you'll see your destination and see that it's still very far away, making me dread the inconsequential combat encounters that were ahead of me. You just go through so much forest that I wish the game actually did something with the supernatural forces you are so very close to brushing with, but more on that in a moment. If Alan Wake ended where it did, without any of the DLC, I probably would have been fine with it. The gunplay and exploration were average, but I just really enjoyed my time with the character, and I would still recommend the game. If you asked me if I wanted more Alan Wake after this, I'd probably say no, especially if it was going to be just more of the same. But luckily the DLC packs the game has offer a decent bit more story and take us to some more interesting locations, though they fucking doubled down on the overwhelming ambush encounters and poltergeist. As I mentioned before, this was my cue to start again and zap that difficulty down. I had a lot more fun this way and was able to make it through the DLC at a real brisk pace, absorbing the story along the way. At this point, I was well on the hook for anything Wake. To be light on spoilers, I can say that this DLC is pretty essential to play, as we've entered a new phase of Alan's journey, and here we see him gain mastery of his situation. This becomes most evident in the standalone DLC, Alan Wake's American Nightmare. It's been 2 years since we've last seen Wake, and without saying too much, he's in a realm. More specifically, he's inside the world of fictional TV show and Twilight Zone stand-in, Night Springs. In it, we explore 3 decently sized zones, doing more Alan Wake stuff. Helping townspeople, killing Taken, and finding manuscript pages left to us by another Alan in another place. Going from Alan Wake 1 to American Nightmare felt like a huge jump to me. There are new weapons, new enemy types, cool set pieces, and slightly more enjoyable exploration. Pretty much like all my complaints from the base game. The story, though, does take a hit. I love the antagonist here, evil twin Alan named Mr. Scratch.
I'm just as real as you are. And I'm the improved version. No fears, no doubt.
Scratch taunts us all throughout our journey and plans to trap the real Wake in this time loop so that he can take the place of Wake in the real. I think the shit is confusing. I didn't find any of the other characters involved in this side story very interesting, more just like props that Scratch uses to upset Alan. It seems the gist of the main plot is that another Alan is writing a manuscript that will be able to free you, Alan, from this time loop created by evil Alan. But the signal is weak. This means repeating the levels 3 times to close the loop. It's not bad, but after clearing the loop, I had no interest in going in for the included arcade mode. Overall, I had a blast with my week with Alan. While I've got a lot of bad things to say, I've seen enough first seasons of TV shows to know that sometimes something is worth sticking with. I've since now moved on to Control, and it'll be a while before I get to Alan Wake 2. I'll just say that I 100% think that it's worth getting him to know him here before going into whatever the hell Alan Wake 2 has to offer. I wish it was on Steam. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next video.